Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Across the Breeze wash processed Ethiopia from House of Funk. And there's the bottle right there. And House of Funk, based out of North Vancouver, British Columbia, and their coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including our recent review of the Take On Me, a wash processed Panamanian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned the interesting shift that House of Funk has undergone, as once upon a time, I remember the majority of their offerings being on the more processed side of things. So when I was purchasing that coffee, I saw this one and a number of other wash processed coffees on their website. So I decided to give one of them a shot, as I don't have too much familiarity with their wash processed coffees, and this one did sound interesting. And given that we were already purchasing directly from House of Funk, I figured let's go ahead and add another coffee on there. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 42. And we actually decided to push the recipe a little bit on this one, opting for a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 98 degrees Celsius, about 208 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. We did go a slight bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, this one was definitely feeling a little bit lighter than the Take On Me, and outside of that, it's still very much in line with the experiences that we had from the previous coffee, which isn't necessarily quite as light as some of the other modern Canadian coffee roasters out there, of course, still alluding to September and Subtext. That being said, it does still feel on the slightly lighter side of things relative to the majority of Canadian coffee roasters that we have had in the past, which still kind of falls in that light medium range for most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it offered an above average level of intensity for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, as it mostly focuses on the subtle yet pronounced citric tones to it, including a bright bit of citric bitterness in the finish as the cup does cool down. Off brew, there are some slightly sweeter berry tones, as well as a bit of florality, so a lot of what you'd expect from a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. We move on to day 18 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar experience this time around, as it is a little bit more subtle, with there being some better defined honeysuckle floral tones to the cup, a slight bit of citrus yet again with a bit of the berry aspects. So as of these first two impressions, very consistent, very straightforward, just seeing the general improvement from what we were expecting. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the cup is the most toned down and subtle it had been to this point, as it does have a much more tame base with a slight citric attribute, but a generally soft tone, so I didn't necessarily feel like this adjustment yielded the most positive results. So from that point, we moved on to day 24, as we did opt to push the coffee a little bit, and it was by far the best it had been to this point, with greater intensity, especially within the floral sense, as there's a very nice mix of jasmine and honeysuckle-like components, cleaner all around with a slight bit more of the citric bitterness and some slightly berry tones. It was kind of interesting. Usually when I decide to push a coffee, I can kind of gauge how far I can actually push the coffee. This one, as I kind of mentioned, didn't necessarily feel as light as I had expected from House of Funk. House of Funk's just kind of interesting, because if I recall correctly, once upon a time, I felt like their coffees were lighter than this, but it has been a bit since I've had their coffees. So I decided, let's not go too far. And I think that I was actually rewarded with this experience, because I felt like it was kind of the optimal place to push this one. Day 27, same adjustments through the Chemex, and it immediately wasn't as good as the previous impression, as it's skewing much more on an undefined citric sense with a slightly more savory berry tone to it, uneven in general, with a loss of the structure to the florality and a little bit more of a spiced quality to it. Day 30, back to the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and it's performing pretty well, as there is a nice bit of the listed watermelon berry tones to the cup, with a little bit more of a lingering citric zest. And I would say that this time around, that citric quality was a slight bit more zesty. The citric note that they do have listed on here is yuzu, and I can definitely see that, as it does have a little bit more of a zesty tone to it. Nice florality is also present, with a pretty clean cup in general. Day 33 through the Chemex, and immediately I decided we're going to opt for the V60 with our final brew, as I really struggled with this coffee through the Chemex. I could not necessarily get any positive experiences with it, as it was notably more faint relative to even the earlier impressions. Still clean, overall berry tones are diluted in place of a much more zesty citric quality, a slightly sour and spiced tone to it as well. Once again, okay day. All three of the Chemex days we had were not necessarily the best. So on day 36, we opted for the V60, and it has been very consistent within this brew method, as there is a nice lingering citric tone to complement a cleaner base with a notable melon quality yet again. A slightly sour citric quality, which once again, that yuzu is just kind of interesting. It's a little different. It's not necessarily a very, we'll say, defined lemon, but something that just has a little bit more sour zestiness to it. Honeysuckle and jasmine-like florals still present, as that seems to be a consistent theme that we're experiencing within this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. If a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee isn't scoring level 4 for cleanliness, then something went horribly wrong. This one right here is definitely as clean as I was expecting, and obviously a fair bit cleaner than the Take On Me, that Panamanian coffee, given that that one had some things that might have held it back. This one right here didn't necessarily have anything that could have kind of hindered it in general, so level 4, best spots to put it. Finish, level 4, once again, and it did have a lingering citric quality to it, and I have kind of mixed feelings on that, as my preference is maybe some additional or different fruit qualities. The watermelon that they do have listed on here, not necessarily the most pronounced, but that's maybe a quality that I would have liked to experience a lot more in the finish, or even the floral components. Outside of that, definitely did skew a lot more on that citric side of things. Sweetness, level 4, and truth be told, that's probably a slight bit generous, as that Take On Me definitely felt a fair bit sweeter than this one. At its best, it did feel pretty sweet, but what's been kind of tricky about this coffee is the inconsistencies with brew methods. So the Chemex and the April Brewer, both of which could not score a level 4, even close to a level 4 if I'm being completely honest. Those were both very much level 3 coffees, but when brewing it with the V60, I said it's close enough to that level 4. It's probably a little generous, but even then, I would say for a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, I decided to put it up there mostly because it's just generally sweeter than the average wash-processed Ethiopian coffee. Florality, level 4. And I continued to mention the floral components of this one. Going into it, I was fully expecting and hoping that there were going to be a number of floral components, and I was very happy to experience them in a number of different ways. Continue to mention them, jasmine and honeysuckle, both of which were ever-present qualities within this coffee, especially within the V60. Citrus, level 4, I can definitely see the yuzu. The citric quality in this one, I would say, is pretty well defined, given that it's a little bit more unique. Zesty, sour, just a little bit more unique in that regard. Handful of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Once again, kind of interesting. If I recall correctly, I feel like their coffees in the past were a lot more bright and acidic, but it could be because I was working with some of their more processed coffees, and those could have been these slightly more acidic, unbalanced coffees in general. This one, on the other hand, definitely nowhere near the level 4, just a little bit more of a moderate brightness within this coffee. Berry fruit, level 3, was really hoping to get a lot more of those watermelon qualities, but once again, it's not necessarily a component that I experience a lot from coffee in general. So the fact that maybe I primed myself into believing it was a little bit more prominent and present than it was is a really nice factor for it, because it did score a level 3, which isn't bad. And then the stone fruits also scoring there at that level 3. And I do have to say that at times I could experience a slightly sugary stone fruit quality within this one. And it was every bit as prominent as the berry quality to it. So for that reason, it did score there at the level 3. It's not necessarily an overly abundant or prominent quality, but given that the coffee in general isn't necessarily the most intense, a lot of the fruit factors that are felt in a little bit more intense of a manner. So that's why we opted for the level 3. Final thing worth discussing, body level 1. That's interesting to me, because even with it being brewed through the V60, it definitely did not have the most amount of texture. If anything, I would say that the coffee was somewhere between that 1 and the 2 mark, but given the unique experience of it being significantly lighter bodied than the average wash processed Ethiopian, I had to leave it there at that level 1 mark. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I definitely enjoyed this one significantly more than the Take On Me, and I feel like it's because it did have some better defined qualities to it, and it did offer a slight bit more than that Panamanian coffee. So for that reason, it was a nice experience, and it's kind of interesting because I think going back and thinking on my experiences with House of Funk, they've been very different than the last 2 coffees that we have reviewed from them. And it could be because I just have not had too many of their coffees within the last couple of years, but I've had some positive experiences from them. And this one I would say is kind of in that more middle ground where it's nothing that I'm going to remember towards the end of the year. I mean, it's a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, and I've always said they're not necessarily the most exciting coffees to review because most of the time they kind of fall into this category of being, I don't want to say forgettable, but not necessarily the most memorable coffee out there. And that's just kind of where this coffee fell into. But it will kind of give me a good gauge on what House of Funk is doing right now. And it is kind of interesting to see a little bit of the shift that they've had. Since then, I still see a lot of wash processed coffees, so I've seen some more processed ones as well. So it'll just kind of be interesting to continue to keep an eye on them and maybe try some more of their coffees in the future. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it's going to be your standard wash processed Ethiopian coffee. So what might set this one apart from some other coffees is that it does have a slight bit of a unique citric tone to it, a little bit more sour and a little bit more zesty, a little bit more bitter as well, giving it just a little bit more unique of an aspect in that regard. Really nice florals and above average sweetness for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. Those are the best directions and things I could point out on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Cross the Breeze Wash Processed Ethiopia from House of Funk. Thank you for watching.